The United States Treasury just announced the seizure of over $12 billion in Venezuelan state assets. And if you understand what happened the last 3 times a major power did something like this, you'll know why $47 trillion is now quietly moving across borders in the largest wealth repositioning event most people will never hear about. This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition based on documented historical precedent. And by the end of this video, you'll see exactly why your retirement account, your savings, and your purchasing power are sitting right in the middle of a cycle that has played out 3 times in the past century, each time transferring wealth on a scale that redefined the global economic order. The question isn't whether this is happening. The question is whether you're positioned to understand it before it's already reshaped your financial reality. Here's what makes this different from every other geopolitical headline you've scrolled past this week. The Venezuelan asset seizure isn't just about one country or one sanction. It's a signal, a documented marker, and a pattern that economists at the International Monetary Fund and financial historians have tracked across empires, reserve currencies, and sovereign debt crises for over 100 years. When a dominant economic power begins using its control over the financial system as a geopolitical weapon, capital doesn't just get nervous. Capital moves. And when we say capital moves, we're not talking about a few billion here or there. We're talking about the kind of systemic reallocation that, according to the Bank for International Settlements, involved over $47 trillion in cross-border repositioning during the last major shift in reserve currency confidence between 1914 and 1945. That number isn't made up. It's adjusted for inflation from documented central bank records, trade flow data, and sovereign balance sheets that are publicly available in archives from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and academic research from institutions like Harvard and the London School of Economics. Let me take you back to the first time this pattern emerged in modern economic history, because understanding the stages is how you see what's happening right now. In 1914, the British pound sterling was the undisputed global reserve currency. According to data compiled by the International Monetary Fund, over 60% of global trade was settled in pounds, and London was the financial capital of the world. The British Empire controlled trade routes, had the largest navy, and British banks financed everything from South American railways to Asian infrastructure projects. This was the growth phase, the ascension stage where confidence in the system was so high that questioning it seemed absurd. The British government could borrow at interest rates below 3% because the world believed in the stability and longevity of the pound. Public records from the Bank of England show that in 1913, Britain's national debt was manageable at around 30% of GDP, and gold reserves backed the currency with credibility that had been built over centuries. But then the First World War began, and everything changed in a way that fits perfectly into the second stage of this pattern, the overextension phase. Britain needed to finance a war that would cost, in today's dollars adjusted for inflation, over $1.5 trillion according to historical economic research from Cambridge University. To do this, Britain borrowed heavily, printed money, and most critically, began pressuring other nations to keep their reserves in pounds even as the underlying fundamentals deteriorated. By 1918, Britain's national debt had exploded to over 130% of GDP, documented in Treasury records that are publicly accessible. The gold standard was suspended. The pound was no longer backed by the tangible reserves that had made it trustworthy, but because Britain still controlled the financial infrastructure, the banking networks, the trade settlement systems, other nations had no immediate alternative. They stayed in the system even as warning signs mounted. This is where the pattern gets fascinating and where it connects directly to what we're seeing today. The third stage is capital flight, and it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly, then suddenly. Throughout the 1920s, even as Britain tried to return to the gold standard in 1925, confidence was eroding. According to research published in the Economic History Review, central banks in France, the United States, and even smaller nations like the Netherlands began quietly diversifying their reserves. They didn't announce it. They didn't make grand statements. They simply started holding more gold, more dollars, and fewer pounds. By 1931, Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard permanently, and the pound lost over 25% of its value almost immediately. The wealth transfer was complete. Those who had seen the pattern and moved their assets into gold, into dollars, into hard commodities, preserved their wealth. Those who believed the system was too big to change lost purchasing power on a scale that reshaped generational wealth across Europe and beyond. The fourth stage is consequences and resolution, and history shows us exactly what this looks like. The British pound never regained its status as the dominant reserve currency. By 1944, when world leaders met at Bretton Woods to redesign the global financial system, it was the United States dollar that emerged as the new reserve backed by gold at $35 per ounce, and by an economy that represented nearly 50% of global GDP according to World Bank historical data. Britain, once the financial center of the world, became a secondary player. The wealth that had been denominated in pounds, the reserves held by central banks, the trade relationships settled in sterling, all of it shifted to the dollar system. This wasn't a conspiracy. This was cause and effect documented in thousands of pages of economic data, central bank reports, and historical records that anyone can verify. Now let's fast forward to the second time this pattern played out, because repetition is what turns pattern into precedent. In 1944, the United States dollar became the global reserve currency under the Bretton Woods Agreement. For nearly 30 years, the system worked beautifully. The dollar was as good as gold because it was convertible to gold at a fixed rate, and the United States had the economic strength to back it. Countries around the world held dollars in their reserves, settled trade in dollars, and financed development in dollars. According to Federal Reserve historical data, by 1960, over 80% of global central bank reserves were held in US dollars. This was the ascension phase, the period where confidence was absolute and questioning the system seemed almost unpatriotic. But then came the overextension. The United States began financing the Vietnam War and President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs simultaneously, a combination that, according to Congressional Budget Office historical records, cost over $1 trillion in today's inflation-adjusted terms. The U.S. government was spending far more than it collected in taxes, and to cover the gap, it did what Britain had done 50 years earlier. It printed money. By the late 1960s, European central banks, particularly France under President Charles de Gaulle, started noticing something troubling. The United States had printed more dollars than it had gold to back them. France began demanding gold in exchange for dollars, as was their right under Bretton Woods. According to documented records from the French Central Bank and reporting from the New York Federal Reserve, France converted over $1.5 billion into gold between 1965 and 1971. This was the capital flight stage, and it accelerated rapidly. Germany, Switzerland, and other nations followed France's lead. The United States gold reserves, which had peaked at over 20,000 metric tons after World War II, fell to just over 8,000 metric tons by 1971, according to U.S. Treasury records. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made the announcement that would change everything. The United States was closing the gold window, dollars would no longer be convertible to gold, the Bretton Woods system was over. In the months that followed, the dollar lost over 10% of its value against major currencies, and gold prices, which had been fixed at $35 per ounce, began a climb that would see them reach over $800 per ounce by 1980. The wealth transfer was enormous. Those who understood the pattern and moved into hard assets, into gold, into real property, into commodities, preserved and often multiplied their wealth. Those who stayed fully in dollar-denominated paper assets watched purchasing power evaporate. The consequences stage brought a new system, not a replacement of the dollar, but a transformation. The dollar remained the global reserve currency, but now it was backed not by gold, but by oil, by military power, by the network effect of global trade infrastructure, and by the simple fact that there was no immediate alternative. The petrodollar system emerged, where oil-producing nations agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars, creating permanent demand for the currency. According to research from the International Monetary Fund, this arrangement helped stabilize the dollar despite the end of gold convertibility, but it also meant that U.S. economic policy now had global implications in ways that would set up the next iteration of this cycle. Which brings us to today, and this is where the Venezuelan asset seizure becomes far more than just a headline about sanctions. We are witnessing the early stages of the third iteration of this pattern, and the numbers are impossible to ignore if you know where to look. The United States national debt currently stands at over $34 trillion according to the U.S. Treasury's own public data. That's 123% of GDP, a level not seen since the end of World War II. But here's what makes this different from past debt levels. In 1945, the United States was the world's creditor nation. Today, according to the Treasury International Capital System data, foreign entities hold over $7.6 trillion of that debt, with China and Japan alone holding over $2 trillion. The United States is the world's largest debtor, and the dollar's status as reserve currency is the only reason this is sustainable. Now look at what's happening in the capital flight stage, because the signs are everywhere in publicly available data. According to the International Monetary Fund's currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves database, the percentage of global reserves held in US dollars has declined from over 70% in 2000 to under 59% in the most recent reporting period. That might sound small, but we're talking about trillions of dollars in reallocation. Central banks in Russia, China, India, and even traditional U.S. allies like France and Germany have been steadily increasing their gold reserves. The World Gold Council reports that central bank gold purchases reached their highest level in over 50 years in 2022 and 2023, with over 1,000 metric tons purchased annually. This isn't random. This is pattern recognition by sovereign wealth managers who have access to the same historical data we're discussing. The Venezuelan asset seizure matters because it demonstrates the weaponization of dollar dominance, and history shows us what happens when trust erodes in a reserve currency system. When the United States can freeze $12 billion in foreign assets with an executive order, every other nation holding dollar reserves has to ask themselves a simple question. Could this happen to us? According to a report from the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Center, over 40 countries are now actively developing or piloting central bank digital currencies, many of them explicitly designed to reduce dependence on dollar-based payment systems. The Bank for International Settlements documented that cross-border payment systems that bypass SWIFT and the dollar clearing system have grown by over 300% in transaction volume since 2018. This is the quiet capital flight stage, the slow then sudden movement that happens before the system visibly breaks. China has been particularly systematic about this. According to publicly available data from China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange, China has reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities from over $1.3 trillion in 2013 to under $800 billion today, while simultaneously increasing its gold reserves every single month for over 4 consecutive years, according to People's Bank of China reports. The Belt and Road Initiative, which according to research from the Council on Foreign Relations has financed over $1 trillion in infrastructure across 70 countries, is increasingly settled in yuan rather than dollars. Saudi Arabia, the cornerstone of the petrodollar system, signed agreements in 2023 to accept yuan for oil sales to China, a shift that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. These are documented facts from official government sources and international organizations, not speculation. The pattern suggests we are approaching the consequences stage, and if history is any guide, this is where the wealth transfer accelerates in ways that will seem obvious in retrospect, but shocking in real time. The question isn't whether the dollar will disappear. Britain didn't cease to exist when the pound lost reserve status, and the United States won't either. The question is, what happens to purchasing power, to savings, to retirement accounts, to fixed income investments when confidence shifts and when the market reprices decades of accumulated debt and monetary expansion? The Federal Reserve's own balance sheet, publicly available on their website, shows assets of over $7.7 trillion, up from under $900 billion before the 2008 financial crisis. That's money creation on a scale that has no historical precedent outside of wartime emergency measures. So what does this mean for your wealth, your savings, your financial future? History gives us a framework, not a prediction, but a pattern. In both previous iterations of this cycle, those who preserved wealth shared common characteristics. They diversified out of purely paper assets. They held tangible stores of value, including precious metals, real estate in politically stable jurisdictions, and productive assets that generate cash flow regardless of currency fluctuations. They understood that during periods of monetary transition, the value isn't in the currency itself, but in what the currency can be exchanged for. They studied history and recognized that what seems permanent, what seems too big to fail, has failed before under remarkably similar circumstances. This doesn't mean panic. This doesn't mean abandoning the financial system. It means understanding where we are in a well-documented historical cycle and making informed decisions based on that understanding. The International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank, and central banks around the world publish data every quarter that shows exactly what sovereign nations are doing with their reserves. If central banks are buying gold at rates not seen in 50 years, that's information. If the dollar's share of global reserves is declining steadily year after year, that's information. If alternative payment systems are growing at triple-digit rates, that's information. The pattern isn't hidden. It's just not discussed in ways that help individual investors and savers understand the personal implications. The $47 trillion figure isn't a prediction of what will happen. It's a reference to what has already happened during previous reserve currency transitions, adjusted for the scale of today's global economy. According to analysis from Credit Suisse's Global Wealth Report and historical data compiled by economic historians, the total repositioning of wealth during the 1914 to 1945 transition, measured in today's dollars, exceeded $40 trillion when you account for gold flows, reserve reallocations, trade settlement changes, and sovereign wealth movements. We are in a global economy that is multiples larger than it was then, with over $100 trillion in sovereign debt, according to the Institute of International Finance, and over $300 trillion in total global debt. If even 10% of that repositions in response to changing reserve currency dynamics, we're talking about wealth transfer on a scale that will reshape everything from real estate markets to commodity prices to the relative purchasing power of different currencies. The choice you have is the same choice that individuals had in 1931 and in 1971. You can dismiss the pattern as irrelevant because the current system has been stable for your entire lifetime. Or you can study the documented historical record and position yourself accordingly. Those who chose wisely in previous transitions didn't just preserve their wealth. They often emerged significantly wealthier because they understood what the crowd would eventually be forced to recognize. The families that moved assets out of pound-denominated bonds before 1931, the investors who bought gold before 1971, they weren't lucky. They were informed and they acted on publicly available information that most people chose to ignore. You now have the same information. The pattern is documented, the current stage is identifiable, the data is public. What you do with that information is entirely up to you, but history suggests that understanding these cycles is one of the most valuable forms of financial education you can acquire. Because when $47 trillion moves, it doesn't move randomly. It moves according to patterns that have been established over centuries of economic history. And the people who understand those patterns don't need to predict the future. They just need to recognize when the present starts looking remarkably like the well-documented past. So, which stage do you think we're in? What numbers from this video surprised you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because understanding these patterns is exactly the kind of conversation that helps all of us make better informed decisions about our financial futures. And if you found this valuable, there's a lot more to explore about how these cycles play out across different asset classes, and what historical precedent suggests comes next.